welcome to day 7 of the TooFatLardies 2021 Advent Calendar. And today, Sidney is donning his artist's smock and getting out his easel in order to tell us about his experience with old masters.
As a wargamer, I've always wanted to try and obtain inspiration from the images, writing, art and literature of the period which corresponds to the wargames I'm playing. I think a great many wargamers do exactly that, looking at contemporary people, places and things to try and understand more about the period of history that they're wargaming. In that regard, I've always been inspired by art, and one of the artists I've most enjoyed is Peter Snayers. And Snayers was a Flemish painter who was born in 1592 in Antwerp, in then the Spanish Netherlands, and Snayers worked at the very highest level of imperial society in Germany, both for the brother of the King of Spain and one of the Austrian archdukes in the 17th century. And Snayers is famous for being one of the preeminent battle painters of the 17th century, an expert in recreating in painted form battles and also other military engagements. Snayers' canvases are really huge. They typically show battles in the 30 Years' War or the 8 Years' War, and they depict the actions between forces which are clearly identified by reference to their formations. So you can see the tercios or the battalions of the troops depicted in the canvases themselves. And Snayers worked from a number of different mediums. He looked at military maps, he was given letters and descriptions of the actions by the participants in those battles, and also he worked for some very influential patrons who were themselves important generals on the imperial sides in those conflicts, one of the most important being the imperial commander Ottavio Piccolomini, who was present at the Battle of Lutzen and other battles in the 1630s. The insights that Snayers gained from his patrons and correspondents who'd been present at these battles and in these wars resulted in his paintings being a very clear and useful guide to how battles were being fought in that period of history. You can trace in his paintings the deployment of an army on the field. Other canvases might show the march of formations to encircle their opponents. Still yet, some of the other canvases might show sieges being established of enemy towns. Often the paintings have a shallow foreground which recedes sharply to give the viewer a bird's eye view of the battle or the engagement. And Peter Snayers' topography and his rendering of terrain that he was painting was very careful, it's very precise, it's quite naturalistic. So when you're looking at those canvases, you obtain a real insight into the scale of a battle and the terrain in which it was fought. Now all of this is fine, but what really interested me about Snayers' work wasn't just what he was painting, but who was looking at it. So he was painting for influential patrons who were themselves commanders in the field, or generals, kings and princes. And he was attempting to create moments of battle, but not just any moments. The images that he was depicting would have been recognisable to his patrons, to the people commissioning those paintings. There would have been a real point of resonance for the viewer. And what Snayers was depicting was history as drama, a dramatic moment of battle. He was engaging in artistic theatre. He was showing battle as propaganda, a military triumph. He was personally aggrandising his patrons and their roles in a particular conflict. So when we're looking at those paintings, we're really looking at the memory of his patrons as to the type of engagement that they wanted to have depicted. We're looking at the precise moment of a conflict that Snayers' patrons wanted to remember. I thought that this made those paintings really suitable for an inspiration for a war game. So on one level, there's the fact that Snares' paintings really are helpful for a wargamer trying to create terrain and trying to create the look of a wargame on a tabletop. You get a sense of the different tactical formations, how they're deployed and where they are deployed in the field of battle. And in the best of Snares' work, his image is really topographic. It's similar to a map which you would draw of the terrain on which the wargame is going to be fought. But there's also a connection, I think, through the wargame to the past, and that comes from the replication not only of history, but also Snares' depiction of history on the wargames table. Snares' patrons were intending to view those paintings and recognise the battle and be able to identify themselves on the canvas, perhaps point to the place where a moment of tactical danger had been identified, or identify where they were engaged in fighting themselves in a very personal capacity, or maybe where a fortunate escape was achieved from the hands of the enemy. The art was really being made for an audience, and the art conveyed a message which that audience would recognise and appreciate. And in a similar way, our war games of the 30 Years' War were really meant to be seen and played. Wargamers around the table would study and view and discuss and argue over the game and the terrain and the placing of the formations on that terrain. They would move their forces in the reincarnation of that particular battle. And I thought that the two situations of a painting being viewed by an audience and a war game based on that painting being enjoyed both visually and as an experience by the players, well, they were very near together. They were not at all far apart. And I like the way that those inspirations came together and how they related to each other. The recreation of the imagery of battle in the paintings, but also creating the personal interaction of a group of people with the war game in a way that had some similarities with how Snares' own patrons might have viewed his canvases when they were presented by Snares himself. And I hope that we were channeling not only the military tactics and deployment of forces at the Battle of Lutzen, but also the personal interaction of Snares' patrons to the visual art that Snares had created. And that connection between Snares and his patrons and my friends as players in the wargame was separated by 400 years. But that contact and that way of placing those two things together, both a visual image which was art, but also the visual experience of a war game, I thought that that was a really fun thing to do with the inspirations which were handed down to me from looking at paintings in an art gallery.